Korthos Delta did not merely burn. It underwent a cold, chemical expiration. Valkyrax stood upon the jagged teeth of a broken capital, her obsidian plate weeping heat into the vacuum, a monument of predatory geometry under the dying eye of a sun. The air was a thick, ionized soup of atomized history and scorched biology, the ghost scent of a world's final breath. She had seen this play enacted on 1,000 stages. Civilizations are but fragile sleeves for the soul, and she was the blade that cut the cord. Fear was the only honest currency left in the hegemony, a universal rhythm that kept the pulse of the conquered steady. Yet, as her gaze raked the line of broken meat, diplomats in silk rags and warriors with shattered spines, she found an error in the code. A human. He stood in a flight jacket that had seen more soot than sky, his posture a blasphemous rejection of the gravity that forced every other knee to the grime. He looked at the Empress of the Void and found not a god, but a punchline. The man was either a digital glitch or a biological disaster. Why does the dread of the grave not find purchase in your marrow, primate? She demanded, her voice a monomolecular edge designed to sever the will of sovereigns. The human offered a slow, rhythmic tilt of his head, his eyes tracing the ruin as if checking the time on a broken watch. He exhaled a cloud of carbon and weary irony. Honestly, I've had Mondays that felt more like a lobotomy, he replied, his tone as flat as a deadline on a medical monitor. Behind Valkyrax, a titan of ethel meat and jagged cybernetics let out a sound like grinding tectonic plates. He mocks the Aethelgard Hegemony, Supreme One. Let me reduce his consciousness to a smear on the pavement. The human held up a hand, fingers steady despite the proximity of a killing machine. Easy there, Chrome Dome. You look like you've got a high-maintenance subroutine for anger management. I'm not looking to be the stain on your resume. Look, the human continued, his hand drifting to the back of a neck that should have been snapping under the pressure. I appreciate the Gothic Doom aesthetic. The brooding armor, the atmospheric genocide, 10 out of 10 for commitment. But fear? Fear is just a neurological tax we can't afford to pay anymore. A warlord stepped into his personal space, a coiled spring of murderous intent. Do you not perceive the scale of your ruin, human? The man scratched a chin stubbled with the dust of a dead world. Let's see, rubble, check. Terrifying aliens with god complexes, check. A queen of shadows who could erase my stack with a twitch of her thumb, double check. I've got the map, big guy. I just don't like the destination. Valkyrax's gauntlet groaned, violet energy crackling across the knuckles like a trapped star. Curiosity, a sharp and unwelcome needle, pierced her tactical resolve. What name do you carry into the dark, human? He offered a two-fingered salute, his grin a jagged scar of defiance. Captain Jake Morrison. Professional nuisance. She had unmade kings for the crime of a misplaced comma. She had extinguished bloodlines for a look of less than total supplication. Yet, looking at Morrison, she felt the strange, heavy friction of hesitation. Take him to the flagship, she commanded, the words echoing with the cold finality of an airlock closing. I will dissect this insolence myself. The warlords were a chorus of silent, armored confusion. Orders were usually simpler, execution or enslavement. Morrison merely whistled as they dragged him toward the sky. Personally, I usually prefer a drink first, but I get the feeling the Void Reaper doesn't have a happy hour. The ship was a 20-kilometer bruise against the stars, a cathedral of violence bristling with star-shatterers and ion fire. It was a place where the soul went to be erased, a tomb built of black iron and cold intent. Morrison, however, walked into its more whistling a tune that tasted of old earth and unspent luck. Even as they marched him through the arterial corridors of the hegemony's pride, veins of crimson circuitry pulsing with the heartbeat of a war engine, Morrison maintained the air of a bored tourist. Top marks for the malevolent interior design, he muttered, glancing at the yawning pits of the reactor core. But the lack of safety railings is a bit on the nose. Don't you think? It screams I don't care about my pension plan. Beside him, Exarch Vorshak, a creature of scarred meat and unyielding duty, let out a low, predatory rumble. You walk through the belly of the Aethelgard pride, human. Silence your tongue. Morrison raised an eyebrow, his eyes reflecting the dark light of the ship. I'm just saying, a few ferns and a bit of jazz would really take the edge off the eternal darkness vibe. It's a bit one note. The Exarch's eyes twitched with a frustration that threatened to bypass his neural inhibitors. They reached the detention block, a gallery of shattered wills and bowed heads. But the silence broke the moment Morrison's boots hit the deck. Hey, folks. Don't mind me, just checking out the local hospitality. Morrison called out to the rows of glowing containment fields. A reptilian prisoner looked up, scales dull with despair. The one who laughed, it hissed. The one who looked at the void and blinked first. Morrison gave a casual nod. Tough room. Needs more decor. Vorshak shoved him into a cell, the field flickering to life with a sound like a soul being digitized. You will wait, the Exarch growled, his voice a gravel pit of suppressed violence. Falcombe will decide which part of you we keep as a souvenir. Morrison shrugged, plopping down on a bench of unyielding alloy. Neat. Hope she's fast. I get real cranky when I miss a meal, terrible for the mental health. As the Exarch stomped away, a black sphere, unit $/Omega$-9, floated into view, its purple optic humming as it scanned his vitals. Morrison leaned in, a predator's focus in his eyes. Well, aren't you a shiny bit of hardware? What's your name? Sparky. The machine responded with a voice as sterile as a surgical theater. Designated unit $/Omega$-9. Overseer of organic assets. Morrison nodded, his fingers tapping a rhythmic code against his thigh. See, that's your problem. No soul in the branding. You need a hook. $/Omega$-9 sounds like a budget tax return software. The probe hovered, its sensors struggling to compute a prisoner who wasn't currently leaking adrenaline. You exhibit no physiological indicators of terror, it observed. Morrison leaned back, closing his eyes. Fear is a heavy sleeve to wear, Sparky. It slows down the reaction time. I found that sarcasm is much lighter on the joints. In the command center, Valkyrax stared at the monitors, her fingers tracing the obsidian armrest of her throne. The hegemony was a machine of perfect order, yet this human was a grain of sand in the gears. She could hear the reports, the way the guards lingered near his cell, the way the silence of the ship was being eroded by the echo of his laughter. The interrogation chamber was a temple of trauma, a cavern of shadows where the air tasted of copper and old screams. Neural destabilizers hung from the ceiling like mechanical spiders, waiting to crawl into the mind and feast on the ego. Kings had entered this room and left as hollowed-out shells, their memories harvested like ripe grain. In the center, Jake Morrison sat suspended in a grave field, his boots propped up on nothingness as if he were drifting on a calm sea. So, quick question, he said to the dark. Is the VIP package usually this gloomy, or do I have to pay extra for a window seat? Valkyrax stepped from the projection shroud, her presence a cold weight that seemed to suck the light from the room. She had watched him for an hour, looking for the crack, the tremor, the lie. There was nothing but the steady, infuriating rhythm of a man who had accepted his death long before he met her. You are a ghost in the machine, human, she said, her voice a low vibration in the deck plates. Morrison turned his head, a slow, calculated movement. And you really need to work on your entrance. A bit of smoke, maybe some heavy percussion? You're a Supreme Warlord. Act like you want the audience to feel it. Valkyrax's gauntlet flexed, the metal groaning. You are a prisoner in the heart of my power, yet you treat this like a low-rent barroom exchange. Morrison grinned, the expression not reaching his eyes. I've had dates that were more threatening than this, and they usually involved less armor. But that's not the point, is it? You're looking for the why. You're looking for the fear that makes the world make sense to you. She stepped closer, her crimson gaze a predatory heat. Do you believe your meat is immune to my fire? Morrison arched an eyebrow. I'm sure you could atomize me before I finished this sentence. But that doesn't make you right. It just makes you loud. You've built a cage out of terror, Morrison said, his voice dropping into a register that made the neural destabilizers hum in sympathy. But a cage only works if the bird thinks the bars are real. You're the Supreme Warlord because everyone agreed to be afraid of you. What happens when the consensus breaks? Valkyrax's eyes flashed like a dying star. I will show you the cost of your philosophy. She tapped a panel, and a holographic ghost of Korthos Delta filled the room. A world being unmade in real time, its crust cracking under the weight of hegemony fire. Look at the ruin. Look at the end of all things. Morrison didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. I've seen it. Humans have been practicing the end of the world since we crawled out of the mud. We invent gods just to have someone to blame when we burn the house down. We're the only species that gets bored of paradise and goes looking for a fight just to feel the blood move in our veins. Valkyrax felt a cold, sharp alienation. It wasn't fear, but the realization that she was looking at a predator far older and more cynical than her own kind. Morrison shrugged. So, am I scared of your big black ship and your fancy armor? Not really. You're just a girl with a very expensive hammer. But should you be scared of us? He offered a smile that was all teeth and zero comfort. That's the question that's going to keep you awake in your fancy throne. She deactivated the hologram, the silence of the chamber suddenly feeling fragile. Return him to the hold, she commanded, her voice betraying the first hint of a fracture. Vorshak hesitated, his hand reaching for the destabilizer controls. The protocol, Supreme One? We should erase the ego. Valkyrax turned away, her cape a shroud of shadow. No. Let him remain. I want to see how far the rot goes. As she left, she felt the human's eyes on her back, a weight more oppressive than any armor. Jake Morrison knew the architecture of cages. He had been sleeved in a dozen different miseries across the stars, from the grease-slicked holds of freighters to the sterile silence of military brigs. But the Void Reaper was different. It was a cathedral that had forgotten its god. As he walked the corridors, he could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The way the Aethelgards didn't just watch him, they observed him. He was a virus in their code, a reminder that the hegemony's perfection was a lie told to the weak. He could hear the whispers in the vents, not of rebellion, but of doubt. Even Sparky, the little probe, seemed to hover with a different frequency. Welcome back to the suite, Morrison muttered as the cell door hissed shut. He leaned against the alloy, his heartbeat a steady, defiant drum. So, Sparky, did you record that? Want to play it back for the boys in the barracks? I'm sure they'd love a bit of theater. The probe's eye flickered, a stutter in its optical routine. My function is surveillance. Your data is being archived. Morrison smirked. Translation. You've shared the file with half the deck already. You're a gossip, Sparky. It's okay. It's a very human trait. 3 days passed, and the silence of the ship began to taste like a held breath. Valkyrax sat in her command nest, looking at the fleet metrics, but the numbers were just noise. She was obsessed with the surveillance footage, not of Morrison's words, but of his stillness. He was comfortable in his own skin, a concept alien to a culture built on the constant maintenance of an imposing facade. Her officers were slowing down. Her soldiers were exchanging glances that lacked the sharp, lethal edge of absolute certainty. The human hadn't thrown a punch, but he was dismantling the hegemony one joke at a time. The structure was failing, the stone turning back to sand. Order is a fragile sleeve. Once the seams start to pull, the whole garment falls away. Valkyrax stood outside Morrison's cell, the air between them thick with the scent of impending rain, a sensory ghost in a ship of metal. You are an infection, she said as the doors slid open. Morrison didn't look up from where he was sketching patterns in the dust of his floor. And you're the immune system. How's the fever? Getting a bit hot under the collar. She stepped into the cell, her presence filling the small space like a gathering storm. My crew speaks of jazz. They ask why the corridors lack greenery. They are questioning the very nature of their service. Morrison offered an easy, lethal grin. Maybe they're just tired of living in a funeral parlor. You can only maintain the dark god routine for so long before someone notices the lighting bill. Valkyrax tilted her head, her gaze searching his face for a lie she could understand. What is your goal, human? Why do you undo what has taken centuries to build? Morrison stood up, his movements fluid and relaxed, a stark contrast to her rigid, armored grace. Maybe I just think you're wasted on this, he said, gesturing to the ship. You've got the power to move stars, and you're using it to make people bow. It's boring, Valkyrax. It's a low-stakes game played by a queen who's afraid to lose her throne. She stiffened, the truth of his words a physical blow to her ego. She had spent lifetimes cultivating a persona of unyielding terror, only for a man in a soot-stained jacket to tell her she was unoriginal. You know what the problem with fear is? Morrison asked, stepping into her personal space. It's a great motivator, but it's a terrible fuel. It burns out. And when it's gone, all you've got left is a room full of people who realize you don't actually have anything to offer them but the grave. The command deck was a theater of doubt. The warlords stood in their ranks, but the symmetry was gone. Their armor felt heavy, their postures lacked the sharp, predatory focus of the past. A rebellion had flared in the Xylosian sector, a minor twitch in the hegemony's limbs, but the decision to crush it felt like a chore instead of a mandate. Valkyrax looked at the holographic map, the red dot of the insurgency pulsing like a heartbeat. Let me guess. Morrison's voice rang out from the back of the deck, where he stood unguarded. You're going to send the Void Reaper, glass the planet, and add another chapter to the book of why everyone hates us. Standard operating procedure. The warlords turned, their hands hovering over their weapons, but they waited. They waited for her. Valkyrax looked at the map, then at the human who had colonized her mind. Fear works until it doesn't, she whispered, the words a confession and a curse. Hold position, she commanded. The deck didn't just go silent. It seemed to lose its gravity. Falcom stepped forward, his cybernetics whirring in protest. Supreme One? The Xylosians must be purged. To show mercy is to invite collapse. Valkyrax turned to him, her eyes no longer burning with the fire of conquest, but with the cold clarity of a new morning. To show mercy is to prove we are more than the weapons we carry. The hegemony will hold. We will not strike first. The words were a tectonic shift. For the first time in the history of her kind, an Aethel fleet did not move to destroy. Morrison let out a low whistle, a sound of genuine surprise. Well, look at that. The Queen of Shadows found a soul. I hope you're ready for the paperwork. Being a good guy is a lot more work than being a villain. The aftermath was a slow, beautiful chaos. The Xylosian rebels, expecting the fire of 1,000 suns, were met with a broadcast of peace. The hegemony did not crumble. It transformed, the fear evaporating to reveal a foundation of something far more durable. Jake Morrison sat in the Supreme One's private quarters, his boots on a table of carved obsidian, sipping a spirit that burned like a supernova. Valkyrax stood at the viewing port, watching the stars, no longer as targets, but as possibilities. You will be insufferable about this, won't you? She asked, her voice carrying a warmth that would have been a death sentence a month ago. Morrison grinned, raising his glass to the void. Oh, absolutely. I'm going to remind you of this every single Tuesday for the rest of our lives. Valkyrax looked back at him, and for the first time in 1,000 years, she didn't see a subject or a prisoner. She saw a partner, and she smiled.